The New York Times made a Nazi look normal and sent its readers into a furor. But what did the Gray Lady really do wrong? I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. So sorry.
I saw what you did there.
That was
sorry
a
about that.
Nazi joke.
Yes. So here's the situation. New York Times does a profile after, in their words, after this the Charlottesville episode with the protest, with the person that got run over by the car and all that kind of stuff. And they decided to follow around a self-professed white nationalist, young guy, American guy, through normal life. And he's like engaged or getting engaged, and he goes to the grocery store and he eats at Applebee's and, just does like a normal guy and talks about his political views. Well, I'm not even going to get into the details of, his political views. I actually only skimmed that story. What fascinated me was the story that the New York Times had to print later, explaining to its readers why they did the initial story, because the readers were apparently very upset that this Nazi guy was made to look normal, like a human, like any other guy next door. So, Bill Whittle, should readers of the New York Times be disturbed that their favorite paper wrote a profile on a self-proclaimed Nazi living an ordinary life?
Well, as the New York Times continues ever further leftward, they're going to find out that their readers are upset about everything. Everything. That every single thing they write about will be a cause of incredible outrage one way or another. It wasn't liberal enough, it wasn't this enough, it wasn't that enough. When you first told me about the story about the Times doing a story about an American Nazi, about a Nazi, this is an important distinction, said that they did a story about a Nazi living in America, and I thought, well, as long as the guy, was he SS, was he a camp guard? If he was a camp guard or somebody wanted, certainly he's not going to do an interview. He's so maybe he was just a regular member of the German Nazi Party. And then you said, no, this is about an American Nazi. And I remember thinking, oh, yeah, I guess we do have some of those. The idea that when you mention a Nazi in America, that actual political philosophy in this country is so almost unimaginable that I just didn't even consider it. Now, with that said, obviously the Times should have run that story, and obviously the people who are complaining about it have got some reading and some thinking to do. There is a tendency, especially with the Nazis and Hitler, there is a tendency to supernaturalize them, to make them essentially a legion of demons that came out of a sulfurous hole in the earth, and therefore any attempt to ascribe human characteristics to them is making it somehow okay. This is precisely backwards. The entire lesson that we're supposed to learn here is that any people, given that kind of an environment, given that kind of propaganda, people who in many ways were good people. I'm not talking about Eichmann, and I'm not talking about Heydrich, and I'm not talking about Himmler or Goebbels, none of those guys. I'm talking about German citizens who grew up in this environment, joined the Nazi Party, and off they went. Now, look, I'm not defending the Nazis by any means. I can't stand them. My father fought against them. I've hated them my entire life, and I continue to hate them, and it is the most un-American philosophy I can think of. But the idea that making them off limits to humanity only empowers that idea, and it basically lets down our guard. My entire theory of the world, entire theory of this government, the ideal of American government, the ideal of individual rights and responsibilities is predicated on the fact, capitalism too, predicated on the fact that human beings are capable of doing some very, very, very bad things, and that human nature, that this is a fault line built into every person's individual heart. It's not something you can socially engineer away. Giving kids gold stars, not going to get rid of it. It's there. People are capable of doing horrible things. And if we don't understand that regular people can become capable of doing horrible things, then we're just going to have to learn this lesson all over again, I suppose.
You know, in defending the story, and this is something that really caught my eye about this sort of non-mea culpa that the Times produced. The Times editors made this statement, and I want to quote it precisely. The point of the story was not to normalize anything, but to describe the degree to which hate and extremism have become far more normal in American life than many of us want to think.
That's just wrong.
The point of the story. Okay, so Stephen Green, it's been a long time since I was in journalism school, but when a reporter is sent out to cover a story, what's the point of the story, and how does that differ with the goal of these editors?
Oh, boy. Well, okay, first of all, I just want to say I'm not going to defend this guy either, because, look, if the color of your skin, who you sleep with, or the contents of your underwear are the most interesting thing about you, then you are a tedious individual. And if you take it to social media, then you are an embarrassingly tedious individual. So the white supremacists and all the rest, they can just, black supremacists, everybody just shut up and get off of Twitter. I'd like to get that platform back, please. That said, what I really like to do, Scott, is I think the New York Times beclowned itself, not with the story, but with the explanation. Oh, didn't you understand that we're trying to show you how horrible this is? It's just editorial disguised as a, we hate America thing. But the point of this is, I would like to address the readers of the New York Times. You were offended by something you read in the newspaper? Welcome to my world, bub. You know, the New York Times, they covered for Stalin. They covered up through Walter Duranty the genocide committed against the Ukraine, in which anywhere from 5 to 8 million Ukrainians were starved to death on purpose so Stalin could collectivize their land into giant state-owned farms. Duranty won a Nobel Prize for his cover-up. Pulitzer, I'm sorry, I said Nobel. Thank you, Bill. Won a Pulitzer for his propaganda, his Soviet Holocaust propaganda, and the New York Times still has that thing on display. They love the Soviets, they love the communists, they hate Americans, and so they go out and they find a guy who's a white nationalist to make the point that all Americans are secretly hateful Nazis. Well, guess what? I'm offended by everything I've read in the New York Times for the last 30 years. Welcome to the club.
Well, there are two elements of this New York Times explanation that caught my eye. And the one is the idea that editors, when they assign a story, when they assign a reporter to go out and cover something, have a point of the story in mind. They've already decided that the point of this story is to show how commonplace hate and extremism is in America. So this is the point, therefore we send you out. Now, just in case you're wondering, and in case you are on the staff of the New York Times and wonder how things really should happen in journalism, this is how it happens. An event happens. Let's say the rally in Charlottesville, and somebody gets hurt, and there are recriminations on both sides and stuff like that. And you realize that your readers probably are not exposed too much to the kinds of people who were involved in this kind of event. And so then you send a reporter out and say, let's do a profile. What are these people like? They seem so alien to us that are these so-called American Nazis. What are they like? Let's go do a profile. And you go to that with an open mind, with the intention of discovering what they're really like. You don't have a point in advance. You don't go out and say, hey, let's do a story about this so we can prove some other point that is unrelated to this guy in flyover country. That's what journalism is supposed to be. It's supposed to be actually deriving from the facts and from the people, the sources, the story, not bringing the story to it and imposing it upon that situation. The second is actually quite laudatory. I think that the New York Times does the right thing when they do a profile that is more broad-based than just a narrow, hey, what does this guy think about politics? What does this guy think about the Jews? What does this guy think about race? I think it is useful, quite useful, for us to see this guy pushing a shopping cart in a grocery store. I think that we have this idea that is largely used to excuse ourselves from the kind of evil that we've seen perpetrated in the world around us, that when somebody commits an atrocious act or stands for some abhorrent idea, that we are so alien to that that this person must be treated as a non-human, and that the only thing that we can do is say he's an animal, or as Bill said, he's a demon. He's completely different from us. There were a lot of ordinary people in pre-Nazi Germany who later became part of the Nazi Party and did horrific things, and they were the guy next door. There were a lot of ordinary people who betrayed their neighbors so that they could get their property, who turned over their own neighbors to the local authorities so that once those people were liquidated and eliminated and taken out of town to the camps, that they could get their property. Evil does not come storming in most of the time in jackboots with a riding crop and a little mustache. Evil comes in on cat's paws. Evil comes in a pleasant way. You know, there's a line from the great movie Broadcast News where one character says to another, it was Albert Brooks saying to the female lead, whose name escaped, Holly Hunter, saying, he's saying, "I'm sorry to tell you that your boyfriend is the devil." And she goes, no, this conversation is over. And he said, wait a minute, what do you think? What's going to happen when the devil shows up? You think he's going to have pointy ears and a long tail and a pitchfork in his hand? No, he's going to be pleasant. He's going to be winsome. And little by little, he's going to reduce our values until nothing means anything anymore. And we need to see that the Nazis in America don't rise out of the pit of hell, as Bill said. They're walking down the Pop-Tart aisle in the supermarket. They're people like you and I. And not only are they nearby, and so you should pay attention to who's around you, but you're susceptible as well. Ideologies of evil catch in the human heart because there's something appealing to them. And you are vulnerable as I am vulnerable. And don't you ever forget it. So I praise the New York Times for doing the story, and I criticize them for their weaselly explanation later on, and the fact that they sent somebody out just to prove that everybody was evil. I'm not saying everybody's evil. I'm saying we all need to be on guard against evil. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thank you to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.